They said the land was gone for good, not struggling, not recovering slowly, gone. The soil was compacted to the point where rainfall just ran off the surface like water on glass. The creek had been straightened decades earlier, turned into a drainage ditch, and the native plants had been replaced so thoroughly that almost nothing wild remained. Farmers in the area called it the dead stretch. Scientists who visited in the late 1990s wrote reports using words like degraded beyond viable restoration. Then a small team made a decision that most people thought was either brave or foolish, depending on who you asked. They brought animals back. Not fences, not chemicals, not expensive machinery. Animals. What happened over the next 25 years surprised even the scientists who designed the project. This is a real story from the American Midwest, and it starts the way most comeback stories do, with something that looked like total failure. By the late 1980s, a large stretch of riparian land along the Kissimmee River corridor in central Florida and similar wetland prairie systems across the Great Plains had been so thoroughly reshaped by agricultural drainage programs that the ecological community was effectively silent. No significant beaver activity, waterfowl populations at historic lows. Fish species that had lived in those river systems for thousands of years were gone from entire stretches of water. The Army Corps of Engineers had done what it was asked to do in the post-war era: control flooding, drain wetlands, make the land useful for agriculture. It worked, and in working, it removed nearly everything else. The people who farmed that land were not villains. They were families trying to survive, responding to government incentives, doing what made economic sense at the time. That context matters because what came next was not about blame. It was about something much more interesting. It was about whether land with no living memory of what it used to be could find its way back. In 1999, a coalition of federal agencies, conservation organizations, and local landowners launched what would become one of the most closely monitored restoration experiments in American history. The core idea was deceptively simple: remove the structures that had been forcing the land to behave unnaturally, reintroduce the animals that had shaped it for millennia, and then the hardest part, get out of the way. The first animals released were North American beavers. 14 of them relocated from a healthy population further north. At the time, several local stakeholders pushed back hard. Beavers flood land. Beavers destroy crops. Beavers are a problem, not a solution. The project team heard that argument dozens of times in public meetings. They went ahead anyway, because the data from similar trials in Europe, particularly the work coming out of Scotland and the Netherlands, suggested that beaver activity could do something no piece of engineering equipment could replicate at scale. Beavers don't just dam water, they restructure entire watersheds. Within 18 months, the 14 beavers had built 11 dam structures across the target area. Those dams slowed water movement dramatically. Slowing the water did something unexpected to the soil. Sediment that had been washing straight through the drainage channels began to settle. Nutrient-rich deposits built up behind the dams. The water table, which had dropped several feet below the surface in some areas, began to rise. And when the water table rises, something wakes up. Seeds that had been lying dormant in the soil, some of them for decades, germinated. Native grasses appeared along the banks, then sedges, then willows. The transformation happened in a sequence that the ecologists on the team described as almost choreographed, each arriving species creating the conditions for the next. It was not random. It was a system remembering itself. If a story like this gives you hope, comment the word hope so we know you're watching. But here is where the story gets complicated, because what the beavers started was not a smooth, uninterrupted success. By year 4, the project faced a genuine crisis. The same water table recovery that was restoring plant life was also pushing water onto privately owned farmland adjacent to the restoration corridor. 3 farming families filed formal complaints. One threatened legal action. The project was almost shut down before it reached the phase the scientists had been waiting for. What saved it was a negotiation that took 2 years and required the project team to redesign portions of the beaver dam network to redirect water flow away from the most vulnerable agricultural land. They brought in a hydrologist who had worked on similar conflicts in Oregon, they held 14 community meetings, and they reached an agreement that no one was completely happy with, which is usually the sign of a fair deal. By year 7, the results were significant enough that even the skeptics had to look twice at the data. Fish populations in the restored sections of waterway had increased by over 300% compared to the control sections left unrestored. Species of native waterfowl that had not been documented breeding in the area for more than 40 years returned and established nesting colonies. The beaver population had grown from 14 animals to over 90, expanding naturally into adjacent corridors. And here's the detail that the lead ecologist said she would remember for the rest of her career. The soil carbon content in the restored zones had increased measurably. The land was not just alive again. It was sequestering carbon. A dead farm had become a carbon sink. But the most visible change, the one that people could see without any scientific instruments, came in year 11. A pair of river otters appeared in one of the restored creek sections. No one had released them. They had come on their own, following the beavers' waterways north from a population 60 miles away. Where the beavers had rebuilt the structure, the otters had found the fish. Then, in year 14, a single great blue heron rookery established itself in a stand of cottonwood trees that had grown up along one of the beaver ponds. 31 nesting pairs in a location that, 15 years earlier, had been bare compacted dirt. The scientists documented what they called a trophic cascade in reverse. Normally, the term describes what happens when a top predator is removed and the entire system collapses downward. This was the opposite. Reintroduce the right animal at the right level, and the system reconstructs upward, layer by layer, each species calling the next one home. By year 20, the restored corridor covered nearly 4,000 acres. The original investment from federal and private sources totaled just under $12 million across 2 decades. For context, a single mile of interstate highway construction in the United States costs, on average, between $5 and $10 million. The restored land is now managed jointly by the original landowners, a land trust, and the State Wildlife Agency. Some of the farming families who initially opposed the project now participate in ecotourism and receive payments for the ecosystem services their land provides, including water filtration and carbon sequestration. The economics changed because the land changed. And now, in year 25, the project has reached a milestone that the original team never dared put in their written proposals, because it seemed too optimistic to commit to paper. A population of North American river otters is now self-sustaining in the restored corridor. The beaver population is genetically diverse and stable. The native plant community has reached what ecologists call a climax state, meaning it is no longer fragile and dependent on active management. It is simply a functioning ecosystem. And at a recent monitoring visit, the team's ornithologist documented a species of migratory songbird using the restored riparian forest as a breeding stopover, a species whose range had been contracting steadily for 30 years. The bird is moving north again. That detail, more than any graph or data table, is the one that stays with you, because it means the land is not just restored, it is integrated. It has rejoined the larger web of living systems that surrounds it. An animal that had quietly given up on a place, that had simply stopped coming, is coming back. There is a version of this story that ends with a lesson about policy or funding or political will, and all of those things matter. But the version worth holding on to is simpler. 14 beavers were placed in a dead place and trusted to do what beavers have always done. They did not know the land was supposed to be beyond saving. They just started building. 25 years later, the birds are following. If you believe nature still has a chance, subscribe. Your support keeps these stories coming.